Okay, so welcome everybody. First of all, thank you very much for coming in. I'm really happy to see all of you here. I hope that I will kind of fulfill your expectations, or actually, I need to give you some kind of disappointment already, which is that in this presentation, you won't see a single line of code. And to be honest, this is essentially done on purpose, because people write too much code, contrary to what is actually needed. So within this presentation, we are going to focus on a little bit different context. So not only on the code itself, but all the things that are going to be around the code, right? So the environment, the practices, etc., related to software development or product development, because I think, and that's my point that I'm trying to make, is that the understanding of the actual environment you're in may help you out with the software itself. So, as you can see, the title for the presentation is PHP Development for Large Agile Projects, Overview and Hints for Developers. So, an input for this is actually my own experience. So I'm going actually to refer to some like real-life cases that I had in my life. Essentially, myself, I'm a passionate programmer, like for many years, starting from a kid. In the so-called meantime, I was also involved in things like analysis, business analysis, or architecture, or Scrum mastery, or for example, being the product owner, proxy product owner, all that kind of stuff. And what it actually gave me is a little bit insight from different sides on the same problem, which is like software development, right? So what I'm trying to do here is actually to share those insights with you, to show the bigger picture, how it's looking, at least from my perspective, and yeah, and finally discuss it at the end. So let's start. First of all, I would like to point out how the agenda is going to lay out, so a proper like introduction to the problem or base concepts. Then we're going to define a particular problem that we are going to have. Just review the possible solutions for that, and then there's going to be a small summary. Okay, so we have that buzzword agile, right? Today you hear that really a lot. But let's try to dig into like the Cambridge Dictionary definitions for the word. So physically, it means that you should be able to move your body quickly and easily, which means like quick shifts of directions and simply be able to keep up with the pace. So you're simply turning around, switching directions, but you do not lose your speed, your velocity, this kind of stuff. Second, mentally, is to be able to think quickly and clearly, right? So it's not a fixed mindset. It's about being kind of dynamic when it comes to the problems. And finally, the management part, which is used for describing ways of planning and doing work in which it is understood that making changes as they are needed is an important part of the job. So that's the point where developers and programmers actually have the biggest problem. So the second word that's in the title is large project. So we could actually ask ourselves, and I got that question, what's actually a large project, right? And the consultant answer would be, it depends, right? So you can think about large projects in terms of like big code base, or a lot of services to maintain, or a lot of users, a lot of data, or a lot of teams on the project actually, right? So there are many factors that could set a project and make it to be said that it's large, right? So the second question could be possibly that, can something that's large be agile at all? If you have a like big object, its ability to be agile in terms of shifting directions and adapting to certain stuff is quite reduced, right? So actually, nature found the answer for that. This is a flock of birds. As you know, this kind of loosely coupled structures, you know the key point, loosely coupled, they are able to move in the different directions. Why? Because all of them are connected only on a like conceptual level. They're connected by the idea of moving in a certain direction, but they're not physically connected. Now, this is a thing that we also should do kind of, like instinctively. We like to divide, and we should divide bigger problems to smaller ones. So let's look at a typical, let's call it project, but I actually crossed the project part out because the first way about thinking about your software or the thing that you do is actually making kind of a product, right? So right now, if you look on this, you can imagine that this whole box is your product that you're developing. Now, inside, in fact, there are always some natural lines that can allow you to break the problem more and more down. So these may be like bundles. If you have like a Symfony project, which is, I don't know, a monolith or something like that, this could be particular services in SOA architecture. These could be microservices, etc., right? So the way I really like to think about this kind of stuff in terms of programming is the way that Visual Studio and Microsoft did it in their IDE, which is calling the thing on the left a complete solution, and these elements here, different projects. So if you're breaking out your product actually to parts, it's finally forming a kind of a solution, and each part of it is a different project. Now, the thing is that you really need to think about your product as a solution for some particular problem, which may consist of small atomic elements, like a service in this kind, like a bundle, like a, I don't know, module. And what's really important, each one of those blocks deserves the same amount of quality. Each one of those blocks deserve the same amount of care. Now, back again, we have a known integration process, right? You take the bits, you take the services, you do some integration testing, you finally integrate it whole and entirely to a whole solution and deploy it back as a full solution. So a different thing around here is the talk about the fundamental problem that we are going to solve. So there's one thing that's sure about software development, like in general, there always will be a change. Now, the change may come in a different form. It may change, it may be a change related to scope. It may be a change related to the team. So if you're losing like half of the people on the team, you still have to adapt to it. So you probably will have to change the way you work in order to deliver stuff on time with the right quality and this kind of stuff. Now, I think it's very important for everybody to remember that, because the sooner we accept the fact that our work could be at any given moment modified by a change of a different sort, and being like mindset ready to embrace the change actually makes you feel like better and give you some relief. I want to make a small experiment with you guys. So that are the best requirements that you could possibly get for a product. So a small to-do list. Let's call it, for now, our little backlog, which consists like of 4 items that should have been developed within the product. So you should be able to display a product, you should be able to put a product in the cart, you should be able to place an order, and eventually there are going to be some vouchers that will give discounts to people, right? So the experiment is, these are like 4 thingies that you have to kind of implement. So I'm giving you guys like 1 minute to think about an architecture for this, like an initial one, an initial proposal. How would you model that problem yourselves if you had, like a chance to implement this kind of stuff, okay? So a minute to figure out your best architecture that you possibly could do for this. I'll play a management person, half time left. Where it's going to be done? ETA, this kind of stuff. Okay, so we run out for the minute. So I think everybody has like a grasp of how they want to approach it. Now, let's say you've started the work, 2 weeks passed. So you're able to actually display the product. Congratulations, it's really, really awesome. Second thing, you even are able to put the products in the cart. So that's really cool. Actually, you started the order placement, but didn't finish it at the time. So actually, you didn't even touch the vouchers at the point, right? But since 2 weeks passed, when it comes to agile environments or actual market, because that's e-commerce, right? This is a typical e-commerce problem for a store. So for some reason, I don't know, the business comes in and tells you, well, we need product comparison first. Before we finish the rest of that, we need product comparison. Actually, besides that, we need like product sets. And these product sets should be functional because I should be able to put a whole product set into the cart. And I need others also functionality on the product view. Also, before we go with vouchers, I actually want a discount code and then some kind of invoicing perhaps, and this kind of stuff. So please tell me if it's that how you feel. This is happening to really a lot of people, because initially when you are trying to figure out like kind of an architecture for your solution, you're not having the broader context, and the more dynamic the problem is, the more things that you do not control are going to come in. So for example, if you're working in like e-commerce sites, next to Christmas, things really get crazy because a lot of people are buying stuff for Christmas using websites these days, right? So business always can come in with a new idea. So eventually, it's really easy in this kind of situations to end up like with this feeling and with this kind of product. That's actually a really old image. So how Apple does it, how Google does it, and actually how will you do it, kind of. Everybody saw that, right? And that's not even PHP MyAdmin. It's like a user story. So how do you possibly can, that actually, I think to be fair, PHP MyAdmin is a really cool software because I'm personally in the opinion that since you can train people to use that in your product, you can train them to use PHP MyAdmin and operate on tables. And they will probably do the same amount of work with the same amount of time. So if that's the case, you're doing it wrong, right? It's like bad by design, kind of. So as you see, it's a pretty intense process. You can end up with like really awkward results. So how we can manage it? We actually need some kind of way to deal with these kind of changes, right? To avoid these kind of situations, because that's, you know, building up technical debt, building up like functional debt or this kind of stuff. We don't want to do that. So the thing is that, going back a little bit to the beginning of the presentation, we need to kind of stay agile about things. So in order to, you know, like be able to shift in those when new obstacles pop out in front of you. But there are, I think, limitless things that limit your ability to be agile. And for example, it may be the programming language itself. PHP in that regard is quite open. You can do a lot of things in different ways, but it actually makes a problem itself because of that. The second thing is like the organizational culture. So depending on the place that you're like working or on the client for you're working, it may totally influence you in terms of what kind of decision you can make, what's going to happen right now, and this kind of stuff. The business model, that's very important. Today, Agile is essentially kind of sold all the time. So you can have like two types of company. You can have a product company, which is using Agile, and in this case, people mostly are quite committed to the product, right? A lot of you guys are working in a single product, and it's your day-to-day work, and you want to get that software to be really good and benefit users, right? But things are quite different when you're working for a service providing company. So for example, essentially developers are rented, and these kind of developers actually go into the product, they build the product, but in the back of their heads they know that if this isn't going to be that product and this project, I'm going to work for a different client without changing my employer, for example, right? So if you have people like that, you may then end up with totally different results. Things further, processes, methodologies, and workflows. Whoa, Jira. You probably saw the most basic workflow on Jira. It's like to do in progress, a couple of closed status reopened. It's really sad if you need to spend like 2 hours clearing out your workflow in Jira because it's that complicated. I actually had this case. We were working on a project that had really complex workflow in Jira. I had to spend like 2 hours to move things around because we had to get acceptance from like everybody on the project, regardless of who it was. I would even say nearly a janitor. So this kind of complex workflows actually also impede your ability to, like, I don't know, deliver or get the proper feedback fast. Requirements for the product. These are the things that you saw are, in the to-do list, in the example, these are actually functional requirements. But today, the important requirements are also the non-functional requirements. So for example, responsive. So support for mobile, things like security, things like performance, things like scalability, etc., etc. With each new non-functional requirement, you add another complexity level to the product. So imagine that your architecture or your solution that you figured out a couple of minutes ago would have to be now like extremely secured. So all of the data related to the clients should have been encrypted, probably moved to a different storage because of that, and this kind of stuff. Is your architecture going to be able to adapt to this kind of change easily without, building up a really big cost? There's a whole, if you look on Wikipedia for a list of non-functional requirements that are like industry standard right now, that's a really long list. And if you have so complex requirements in terms of non-functional, which actually are being carried out from feature to feature to feature to feature, You may add the functional requirements, but they will still have to slice through all that non-functional stuff on the way. Implemented solutions. So you've picked a bad framework. You've hacked a couple of things. So now if you're going to add new functionality, you will need to hack a hack and then hack it again. And it's like endless inception, right? Because if your implementation is, sorry to say, crappy, actually you're going to pay for that. So here kicks the term technical debt, right? So about technical debt, it's going to be there always. You're not going to be ever able to pay it off like completely. It's going to be always. So if you cannot like remove it completely, you only can manage it. So do your best to avoid technical debt, because it's going to kick back and fight when you're going to add new functionality. Of course, the teams themselves. So imagine you have a project where you have, I don't know, like 4 or 5 teams of different people in different locations, different time zones, different cultures, this kind of stuff. People that do not know each other, but still they meet on the single code base. So fights happen, misunderstandings happen, some painful code reviews happen, especially those, because people actually, when it comes to code reviews, it's a funny thing. People feel quite really protected when it comes to commenting somebody else's code, because if I were talking to you directly, we probably would put up a fight, right? But in terms of comments, it's safe to post any kind of insult inside that comment box, right? He ain't going to hit me back. So this kind of things actually give you the permission to fight a little bit, and this actually makes the whole project pay, right? Because your code is not integrated with everybody else, story is delayed, and you know what are the repercussions. And this finally touches people. Actually, Ken Beck, in his book about extreme programming, wrote about a funny technique of 5 whys. So if you have a problem, you actually should ask why for 5 times, and you always find that this is a people problem. So for example, our builds are constantly failing. Why they are failing? Because somebody is doing something. Okay, why he's doing it, right? So within 5 steps, you are actually able to find out what's going to happen. And this is a practice from extreme programming called root cause analysis, right? So if things are really bad, you need to know why. So the technique of 5 whys actually is really good for that. So as you can see, the problem is really complicated. So I decided to break it down to separate parts and define the dimensions for the solution. So the dimensions that I would like to define are on the product level. So I'd say I want to build the right product. So meeting the requirements for the users and essentially being applicable for business, right? The second thing is about the teams. So when I'm part of the team, I want to build, it's a typo there, but I want to build the product in the right way. So it's a build the right product, contrary to build the product right. So the last part is the individual. So I want to do a great job in a great environment. So in order to address these 3 levels, we are going to talk about each one of them separately, and you won't be actually, surprised that in terms of product we are going to use Scrum. Actually, I heard there's a statistic that like 66% of agile projects are being done using Scrum. How many of you was working with Scrum? Okay, quite a lot. And the rest didn't work with Scrum or worked with the other stuff, like Kanban. Okay, who's working 100% hardcore waterfall? With micromanagement? Oh, okay. We need to save that guy, actually. Okay, so just to rephrase, I really want to quickly go through that. You know the story, product backlog. So functional requirements, the thing that's really important about this image is this, that at the top of the backlog, you have really small stories in terms of estimation, complexity, effort required, and this kind of stuff, right? So who's responsible for playing with the product backlog? Is the product owner. And the role of the product owner is put the most important stuff at the very top, so it contains the most valuable things to do, right? There's a thing called ongoing refinement process. We have the sprint team, which based on the sprint planning, for example, each 2 weeks, builds up the sprint backlog, so they pull in the most important things. That's actually quite legitimately shown. That's this bit put over here, right, into the sprint. Then they go with the daily scrums and all that meetings that the management hates. Eventually, they show something on the sprint review, also make a retrospective. Everything has a feedback loop. So new requirements, as you can see, from each sprint review, new things can kick in like 2 weeks. And it should happen. If it's not happening on sprint reviews, it's really bad, right? But also some ideas about how you are working are going in here. There's a different thing. Anybody heard about that? Very good. Somebody sees a StarCraft reference or not? Okay, we require more minerals. So it's this kind of thingy. Okay, for those who do not know, you know, essentially a Scrum team consists from like 5 to 9 people. So it's a quite limited amount of people on the project, right? But today things have to scale. So Nexus framework is prepared for scaling Scrum, which essentially means that now you do not have like single team, but up to 9 teams, fully functional 9 Scrum teams. Each of those teams have one, let's call it an expert or a delegate or representative, as it's said in the Nexus framework document. And these guys, those guys from those teams form the so-called Nexus team. And these people are responsible for picking up the stories for the teams, managing dependencies so that different teams do not get into the way of one another, just to, you know, like still be able to integrate stuff. Now, why I'm putting this over here? Because in a big project, you might have like multiple of teams, right? So if you're not coordinating this and things go wild, this is going to kick you at some point. So that's why I'm pointing this as a solution for the product level, right? So if you want to organize things, you should possibly do that. Now, the thing that people frequently misinterpret, do not understand about Scrum is not doing the product level by level by level by level. So that's what the top picture depicts, right? So you're not making the wheels, you're not making the, I don't know, the body of the car or different parts, then integrate it and you get the happy client at the very end. It's rather gradually improving the design in order to get to the place where your client can be. As you can see, the architecture changes. You don't start with actually the whole car as a concept already. You build it up gradually. And the funny part about this image, the outcome is different. Because during the time, we've actually discovered that the guy doesn't want to have the roof in the car, right? So he wanted a cabrio instead of a roofed one. So if you're thinking about Scrum and being, you know, like agile and how to build a product, that's kind of a mindset that I think everybody should have in terms of understanding. Like, keep it simple, stupid, right? Let's build the minimal and functional thing that we need and just move forward. So the last thing that I want to put in terms of agile itself, there was a clarification made recently, this year, by the guys who invented Scrum, and they decided to put explicitly the Scrum values, and I think it's really important to everybody to understand what are the values and what they mean. So it's like courage, focus, commitment, respect, and openness. And I'm not going to read it all, you can read it all yourselves, but these values are really, really important if you're working on an agile project with people from different locations, different teams, different cultures, etc., etc. Each one of this is equally important. A funny part about commitment. In the first versions of Scrum, the word commitment was used to describe what the people are actually going to take in the sprint, and people were, you know, like brought to account based on their so-called commitments. Now, the guys already saw that this is getting, you know, like misused by, especially by microcontrolling management people. So they changed the name to forecast. So the teams aren't making commitments at the beginning of the sprint, they make a forecast how much they can possibly deliver. And now they decided to bring back the word commitment, but with explicit clarification that this is not about making a promise or anything like that, because we do not know what's going to change in the meantime, right? It's that people personally commit to achieving the goals of the Scrum team. So it's like not committing that you will like deliver it in 100%. It's that you are going to do your very best to do it. And it's only about mindset. It's not about, I don't know, like particular stories or this kind of stuff. Okay, so there are some problems with Scrum that you need to be aware about. One of those is like using it like a weapon. So we call it a weapon shield. What's that? It's, for example, if I'm going to use it as a shield, no, you cannot approach the team. We're agile. You cannot modify it because we have a sprint. So you need to wait for a sprint. And this is like using agile to justify things that you don't want to do. So you're using it like a shield. And contrary, the whip part, actually related to the Dark Scrum by Ron Jeffers, is the place when the management kicks in and they want to be on your retrospective, and they want to lay all the tons of hate that they have because of the last sprint on you during that retrospective, for example, right? So using Scrum as a pressure tool instead of a thing that will help you out to develop things. Another problem, another set of problems that I personally see is that you feel like you have like constant deadlines. So each sprint is a deadline, 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 deadline. So if these are being considered as deadlines, what happens? If you're close to a deadline, you're making mistakes. You're making trade-offs. You will sacrifice tests. You will sacrifice quality this way just in order to deliver. So this is actually wrong. And another thing, narrowed perspective. So within a sprint, you need to work on a certain set of functionality, but still, you need to have like a broader context, what may possibly happen in a second, right? So if you have the narrowed perspective, narrowed only to the scope of the sprint itself, you're probably going to have architectural problems as well in the future. And I'm putting numbers because I have references at the end of the presentation. This is an article about 24 Scrum pitfalls summarized. And it's really worth reading. So the biggest problem and what's really painful for Scrum and for teams is that when you have actually waterfall people trying to do waterfall using Scrum and nothing changes except that you have like deliver everything 2 weeks with perfect quality and this kind of stuff, and you're getting kicked for any kind of, I don't know, delays or something like that. Okay, so within the team levels, as you can see, Scrum on its own leaves the implementation details to the teams, to the developers. Scrum never said that you should use a certain technology or design code and this kind of stuff only by yourself. So, by any means of Scrum ways, right? There's nothing in there. It's like that Scrum is really good for the product level, but when things go to the sprint teams, a different stuff is actually required to go with this. And this is the place where I think that extreme programming practices kick in. So a brief introduction to the extreme programming. So inventor, Kent Beck, possibly. Who knows Kent Beck, by the way? Okay. Kent Beck, also the inventor of test-driven development. Author of JUnit, the first unit testing framework created for Java. He splits the extreme programming practices to two different categories. These are primarily, and so that's a really hard word. It's like corollary or something like that. The thing is that the division has been made in order to separate those things with which you can start from the things that would be really hard to start at the beginning. So for example, in terms of primary, you have things like energized work, pair programming, and 10-minute build. Or on the second category, you have things like customer involvement, incremental deployment, or shrinking teams. The thing is that the second set of practices actually has a lot of requirements in order to be implemented correctly. So he had sort of advises to go with the primary first. But I don't like that division, to be honest. I think there's a better better way to do that. But in a second, as you can see, XP, so extreme programming, also has values: communication, feedback, simplicity, courage, respect. Pretty close to Scrum itself, looking back on the previous slide. So these two things actually, when it comes to like the basis, so the values that they want to address, are quite the same, especially that actually both guys from Scrum and Kent Beck and also Uncle Bob and these kind of people, they all signed the Agile Manifesto, right? So it would be hard to be like different in that regard. So the other way to split those extreme programming practices are by splitting them on coding practices, development practices, and sorry, and business practices. And that's done by the community actually itself. There's a really good and a small book, I think everybody should get one, called Extreme Programming Pocket Guide in English. It's like, I don't know, like perhaps 80 pages, hydrated knowledge about the problem. So if it comes to coding practices, is code and design simply. You have things like, you ain't gonna need it. You probably heard about it. I'm going to just rephrase it back again. Keep it simple, stupid. So applying these kind of rules to how you design and how do you code. That's why I'm not going to show any kind of code right now and in this presentation at all. I just want to reduce it to the things that I really need. Refactor mercilessly. Yeah, thing about refactoring. What's refactoring? Is it, if I'm modifying code and actually I make more writes to the database, that's refactoring or not? It's not, because refactoring is changing the code, but without modifying the behavior of that code, right? And there are a lot of techniques to do refactoring without modifying the actual behavior of the code. And why this is required? Because at the end of the day, when you develop some kind of, like set of code, you need to maintain it so it's going to be usable like tomorrow, right? And that's XP in general encourages you to go with refactoring as much as you can, so the code will be maintainable and this kind of stuff. Develop coding standards. That's a really controversial thing, kind of, because people mostly go with tabs or spaces problems in this kind of places, but I think everybody should download PHP source and check the coding standards that they have as a file committed into the repository. It's even said in the coding standards that if your C function is given a pointer, you never should release the memory from that pointer, only if you have a different parameter, which is a Boolean, that will, your function, right? And if the color of that function tells you true, then you're allowed to free the memory from that pointer, for example, right? So, or from that address. So these kind of things. Why this is important? Because it actually removes a lot of discussions from code reviews. It's not my solution versus your solution. We have a standard here, dude. We decided to do it this way, and we have to keep it this way, right? So it helps in consistency between teams. This is a common contract between people that we are going to do it this way. Develop a common vocabulary. It's a thing that DDD, that everybody loves today, uses. They call it a ubiquitous language. Is it the term? So a proper set of things or terms that are being equally understood between different teams, both business and developers, or the teams themselves, so that everybody is using the same names for the same objects, concepts, etc., to avoid confusion. Second part, developer practices. Adopt test-driven development. Now, test-driven development doesn't mean unit tests only. Actually, Leszek, are you with us? No, I don't see you. But who was on the butterfly effect presentation yesterday? So what Leszek did, Leszek had to deal with legacy code. He didn't write unit tests. I wouldn't write unit tests for that too. But before he modified the code, he created a functional test that actually tests the system and the outcome before he modified that. Test-driven development is not only about unit tests. It's like trying to save some kind of state or incrementally build up to a target solution with keeping your bugs safe. It's like this, and that's really important to remember. You can go with functional tests for acceptance criteria in the stories and automate it. So practice per programming. Personally, I don't like that. Not that I'm an introvert, but I don't like that people have a different keyboard layout. So switching by the one computer actually is quite troublesome for me. But this is the most constraining thing when it comes to people. It requires, like hygiene. It requires proper communication skills and mindset and the attitudes. Really hard to do. You need to find a really good person to do that. Adopt collective code ownership, which means everybody is responsible for all the code, and everybody has the right to modify any line of the code. That's really huge and powerful, but it allows you to be enough committed to the case and take care about the project. Integrate continually. So everybody's heard about continuous integration, right? These are servers. You can use continuous integration servers to do the job. But what's really important about this is that you need to have a proper branching model. Let's use it with the standard Git flow, right? And the thing is that you should actually pull in code from like development branch to your feature branch as soon as new changes come in, like even daily. They say even like 4 hours if that's so dynamic. But if you're waiting with a feature on a feature branch for like 2 weeks and then try to integrate it, kaboom, big bangs. You should avoid them always. So that's why integrating fast and frequently, it's not only about using the CI server, right? This is really required to keep up. So last part, business practices. I'm just pointing them out, and I only marked the red one because this one is really important for the developers, except for this work at sustainable pace. Release regularly, which means like, I don't know, every week, every 2 weeks, perhaps every a couple of days. Why? Because, for example, if you have database migrations or data migrations, if you release frequently, you make those migrations frequently, right? So there's no big migration session that you need to run a deployment for 2 weeks, and the deployment itself will take or migrations will take like 8 hours, because you did that already multiple times on the road. Okay, now the last thing, so individuals. So it's us. us and only us. We need to develop a proper toolkit for ourselves. So the tools at hand that we have are various principles. So we've already covered a little bit of that. We can go with best practices when it comes to coding, development processes, publishing, deployments, automation. Everybody should kind of study the subject, on his own, depending on the project and this kind of stuff. Knowledge about patterns. So there are a series of web pages that are going to be available, but there are 3 types of patterns that I would like everybody to know. These are, of course, design patterns. Then we have the enterprise architecture design patterns. And also Kent Beck wrote a different book on patterns. These are called implementation patterns. So really small patterns, even to a class or method level, that could be applied in order to make like really good code. So I urge everybody to dig into like all 3 of those types. Powerful programming languages. So not necessarily, sorry, but PHP is not necessarily the only language on the world when it comes to solving problems. We already saw that on different presentations. People go with Go, people go with Java in different cases, and that's pretty okay. Because in the end of the day, you need to solve a problem in a most efficient manner. So if doing a small technological switch will unlock your agility in the future, I would definitely do that. Literature. So hello, it's 2016. Most of the concept that we are talking about, like extreme programming, like Scrum or this kind of stuff, is based on ideas that were developed in past century. A lot of the books and the knowledge itself is like really back from the past. The problem with PHP community is that, and the language itself, is that we mature really slowly. It's getting better from year to year, but a lot of things are already there. It's already in the books, already in the other languages. It's a matter of learning. We have a lot of manifests. One of them is the Agile Manifesto. The second is Software Craftsmanship Manifesto. Who's heard about software craftsmanship? Okay, you guys sign up for it, or you just heard about it? That's an open question. I do not expect an answer. So yeah, the thing about the second one is there's actually a movement of people who decided to keep up with like constantly learning and improving and going a little bit out of the scope of a single technology because they treat software not as a like child or something like that. They treat it as a craft, software development as a craft, and they want to be masters of the craft, thus constantly improving. And if you go with that path, I deeply believe that you are going to be a better developer as an individual, and thus you can contribute to the product, to the team, and essentially that's it. So another thing that I really like to cover is the knowledge of anti-patterns. So who knows what's an arrow anti-pattern, for example? It's a really easy thing to spot, actually. If you look on the code and you have things like PHP opening tag, some class, a method, and then if was for else, and this kind of stuff, and you need to go out of the scope. Essentially, that's a code smell, right? And it's looking like an arrow, but yeah, easily to spot. Most probably high cyclometric complexity if you do a static analysis for the code with the tools that we already have, right? But there are numerous other anti-patterns. And I think knowing about the anti-patterns is equally important like knowing the patterns, because you can notice that something is going wrong at some point. And we have like different initiatives, so probably you saw the PHP in the right way web page. People stood up and decided to build up the set of best practices in order to address the problem that actually the internet is full of outdated PHP tutorials, right? So they decided, okay, let's stop people learning some outdated knowledge, let's go with the new ones. So industry standard acronyms, SOLID. Sorry, everybody has to know these principles. Single responsibility, Liskov, dependency injections, interface segregations. These basic principles, actually, if you follow them correctly and you're correctly aware of them, will give you proper quality and flexibility and agility of the code. Things like KISS, we've already talked briefly about this. Keep it simple, stupid. Do not over-design. Always try to get things simple. Do not repeat yourself. So not only code duplication. If you have like tedious processes, automate them. Just release your time so you can do better things faster and this kind of stuff. And you ain't gonna need it. So just remove the things that actually won't be needed. Do not anticipate. Do not do not make assumptions about the business. If business is going to want to have a feature that you're thinking of, they are going to ask it. Until they don't do it. So as with any other kind of tools, you can go bad, go mad with it. Anything put to extreme, like solid put to extreme, is bad. Yagni put to extreme, which will make actually people neglect everything. You don't want that as well. So, closing things up, summary. There are no silver bullets in software development. The thing that I've shown you here is not a complete solution for every problem on the world. It's simply my idea how we could possibly attack these kind of problems. Be pragmatic and balance is everything. Never go to extreme, either one or the other way around. The tools are already there, learn them. So, as I said, PHP has a lot of things like PHP Unit, Behat, you could use Selenium as a driver for functional test with Phantom.js as a headless browser. Limitless, this is already there. Browse this website. If you're going to track like anti-patterns and what people do when it comes to stupid, the daily WTF is one of the nicest sources to do that. When introducing change, do it step by step, avoiding bing bangs. I'm hoping that you guys will come back. One. Okay. I'm closing it up. So I'm hoping that you guys, when you come back to work, you actually will try to dig more into the topic and introduce it, but please avoid big bangs. You will never win by pushing like 10 of those ideas at the time, step by step. The thing that I really like to do, and it's a mantra, learn, apply, repeat. Learn, apply, repeat. Because this is a lot of knowledge, this is a lot of practices to do, and it requires a lot of effort. So this has to be a continuous process. Stay open-minded and always be ready for change. So try to remove that feeling when you saw the change, that business why plan, right? So we don't want that. So what if I'm working with legacy software? Refactoring. Everybody knows the reference. It's hard to get to that point. If you do it wrong, a big ball comes and chases you, right? So you really need to bear that in mind and be careful about when you go with refactoring. And I think we have the time for questions or not? Okay, so let's go with 2 quick questions. I will be happy to discuss all that stuff with any of you. Somewhere there. Let's call it. Okay, anybody wants to ask something? I kind of anticipated that. Thank you very much. If somebody, come again? It was me, like 10 years ago. So yeah, in terms of references, I can give you some, like links or books when it comes to that, so you can track down things yourself. Once again, thank you very much for coming.